England had never gathered for a wedding quite like this one. Hundreds packed the pews of St. Aldrich's Church that autumn morning, not to celebrate a love story, but to witness what they believed was the greatest humiliation of the season. Lady Evelina Marchmont had spent 23 years as the favorite target of London's gossip. They called her the ugliest daughter in England. They whispered that no gentleman could ever truly want her. So when Gabriel Ashford, the bankrupt Duke of Rensworth, agreed to marry her, society reached only one conclusion. He had sold his honor for her fortune. The laughter began before she reached the altar. It continued through the vows. No one noticed that the groom never laughed. No one noticed the quiet warning hidden in her father's smile. And no one imagined that before the first night of their marriage was over, Gabriel would discover something beneath his bride's wedding gown that had nothing to do with her face. Something that would make him kneel before her in horror. Something that would unravel a secret buried for years inside one of England's most powerful noble families. Because the greatest lie in that church wasn't that Lady Evelina was ugly. It was that she had always been safe.
Gabriel, I cannot. The risk
And before the
is
sun
too
rose
great.
over Rensworth Hall, one man would finally learn the truth she had spent a lifetime hiding. If you love a slow burn romance where the
Love
wounded
is
find
not
each other
enough.
before they find
They
justice,
will mock
stay with me.
us.
Because before we begin, I'd love it if you hit that like button. It genuinely helps this story reach more people who need a little hope tonight. Now, let's step back into St. Aldrich's Church, on the morning England came to mock a bride who deserved so much more than pity. The church bells had not yet finished ringing when the whispering started. "There she is," someone murmured from the third pew, not troubling to lower her voice. "Poor thing. I hear he requested the veil be doubled." "He's not a fool," came the reply. £40,000 a year buys a great deal of tolerance. Evelina Marchmont walked the aisle with her spine straight and her chin high, though her hands, folded before her, trembled beneath white gloves. She had learned, over 2 decades of English cruelty, that the moment you let your face show pain, the crowd multiplied it. So she gave them nothing. She had practiced this stillness in mirrors since she was 12 years old, the art of being looked at without flinching. Her father, Edmund Marchmont, the Earl of Cravenhurst, walked her down the aisle with a smile so warm that strangers wept to see it. He looked, to every observer, like a devoted father delivering his daughter into a fortunate match. Only Evelina knew what that smile concealed. Only Evelina understood the particular pressure of his hand at her elbow. Not affection, but warning. Behave. Smile. Do not embarrass this family. She had been behaving her entire life. At the altar stood Gabriel Ashford, Duke of Rensworth, tall, composed, and entirely too still for a groom about to marry a fortune. His family estate, Rensworth Hall, in the wilds of the Yorkshire moors, had fallen into near ruin after his father's disgrace 3 years prior. A treason conviction so sudden and so total that the old duke had died in an asylum before the ink dried on the verdict, his name stripped from every register of honorable men in England. Everyone assumed Gabriel needed Cravenhurst gold to save his crumbling house. Nobody guessed that Gabriel had spent the past year quietly investigating the very family he was about to marry into, because something about Edmund Marchmont's sudden generosity, his eagerness to marry off his unfortunate daughter to a disgraced duke instead of a wealthier suitor, had never sat right with him. When Evelina reached the altar, Gabriel did the one thing no one in that church expected. He looked directly at her face, at the birthmark half of London called a monstrosity. And he did not look away. He did not wince. He did not offer the practiced half-smile of a man being generous about an unfortunate feature. He simply looked at her the way he might look at any bride, with quiet, searching attention, and then he offered her his arm. "Lady Evelina," he said, low enough that only she could hear, "you need not perform for these people today, not for me." It was such an unremarkable sentence, and yet Evelina had not heard its like in all her life. Her eyes stung, and she despised herself for it, because tears in front of an audience were precisely what she had trained herself never to give. The ceremony proceeded. Vows were spoken. Rings were exchanged. And when the vicar pronounced them man and wife, the congregation applauded with the particular enthusiasm of people who believe they have just watched charity performed in public. Evelina heard none of it. She was watching her father's face at the edge of her vision, and for one unguarded instant, she saw something flicker there that was not pride and was not affection. It was relief. as though a great danger had just been safely passed along to someone else. The wedding breakfast at Cravenhurst Manor stretched long into the afternoon, a parade of toasts and false warmth that Evelina endured with the same practiced stillness she had carried down the aisle. By the time the carriage finally rattled north toward Rensworth Hall, dusk had settled over the moors, and Evelina sat rigid against the seat cushions, watching her new husband from the corner of her eye. Gabriel had said little since the church. He was not cold, precisely, but he carried himself like a man holding something carefully, the way one might carry a lit candle through a house full of dry curtains. "You needn't fear me," he said finally, as the carriage crested a hill and the dark silhouette of Rensworth Hall rose against the horizon. "Whatever this marriage is to become, I did not enter it to hurt you." "Everyone believes you married me for my father's money," Evelina said quietly. It was the first honest sentence she had spoken all day. "Everyone believes a great many convenient things," Gabriel replied, and something in his tone made her look at him properly for the first time. "I find that the truth is rarely so simple." She did not ask what he meant. She was too tired and too wary of hope to ask. Rensworth Hall was grand in the way of old families fallen on hardship, the kind of grandeur held together by pride rather than money. Dustcloths draped over furniture in wings the family could no longer afford to heat. A skeleton staff greeted them, an elderly housekeeper named Mrs. Prescott, whose eyes lingered on Evelina with unreadable curiosity, and a valet, Thomas, who would not quite meet the new Duchess's gaze. The wedding night arrived the way a held breath finally releases, inevitable and dreaded. Evelina's maid, a nervous young woman named Agnes, who had traveled with her from Cravenhurst, helped her prepare for bed in near silence. When Agnes reached to unlace the back of Evelina's gown, her fingers brushed against a raised line of scarring at Evelina's shoulder blade, and the girl went very still. "My lady," Agnes whispered. Say nothing," Evelina said, sharper than she intended. "Please, say nothing to anyone." Agnes nodded, wide-eyed, and finished her work in silence. When the maid had gone, and Evelina stood alone in the vast, unfamiliar bedchamber, she heard the knock she had been dreading since the ceremony began. Gabriel entered slowly, giving her every opportunity to refuse him entry, which she noted even through her fear. He crossed half the room and stopped, keeping distance between them, when he saw her flinch. "Evelina," he said gently, the first time he had used her Christian name without title. "I am not going to hurt you. Whatever you fear from me, you needn't." "It is not you I fear," she said before she could stop herself. The words hung in the air between them, more truth than she had meant to give away. Gabriel's expression sharpened, not with suspicion of her, but with a dawning, terrible understanding. "Then who?" he asked quietly. She did not answer, but her silence was itself an answer, and when a tear escaped despite her best training, Gabriel crossed the remaining distance and, with a gentleness that undid something she had kept locked for 20 years, simply said, "You do not have to tell me tonight. But I would ask one thing of you, as your husband. Let me see that you are unhurt, nothing more." It was the smallest of requests. It was also, Evelina realized with a jolt, the first time in her entire life that anyone had asked her permission for anything concerning her own body. When she finally allowed him to see the raised white lines across her wrists where rope had once bitten deep, the puckered old burn along her collarbone, the map of old violence written across skin that had healed around cruelty like a tree grows around a nail, Gabriel Ashford did not recoil. He knelt. He knelt before her the way a man kneels before something sacred, and when he looked up at her, his eyes were wet with a rage that had nowhere yet to go. "Who did this to you?" he asked, and his voice had gone rough with barely leashed fury. Evelina's throat closed. She had spent her whole life protecting the answer, because the answer was the most powerful man she knew, and she had learned, at great cost, what happened to those who accused him and failed. "My father," she whispered at last. "It was my father." Gabriel did not sleep that night. He sat in a chair beside the fire while Evelina finally slept. Truly slept, she would tell him later, for the first time in years, simply because someone was standing guard who was not a threat, and he turned over, again and again, everything he had learned in the past year of quiet investigation. He had suspected Edmund Marchmont of financial fraud. He had suspected him of manipulating markets, of ruining rivals, of buying silence where money could not buy loyalty. He had never suspected this. But as dawn broke gray over the moors, Gabriel Ashford made himself a private vow, one he would keep though it cost him everything. He would find out exactly what Edmund Marchmont had done, to his wife and to whoever else stood in his way, and he would see the man answer for it before the whole of England. He did not yet know that this vow would lead him back to his own father's ruin. The weeks that followed at Rensworth Hall unfolded slowly, like a wound learning to close. Gabriel made no demands of his new wife beyond her comfort. He asked Mrs. Prescott to move Evelina's rooms to the sunniest wing of the house, over the housekeeper's mild surprise. He dismissed, without explanation, the physician Edmund Marchmont had kindly arranged to attend Evelina during her adjustment to married life, a Dr. Percival Wren, whose letters of introduction struck Gabriel as unusually solicitous for a man he'd never met. "I do not require a physician sent by my father," Evelina said, when Gabriel informed her of the dismissal, and something in her tone told him he had guessed correctly that there was more to fear there than a simple family courtesy. "Then you shall have none but the one you choose," Gabriel replied. Slowly, so slowly that Evelina almost didn't notice it happening, she began to speak. Not everything, not at first. She spoke of small things. Her mother, Lady Helena Marchmont, who had died when Evelina was 14, officially of a wasting illness. She spoke of the years after, when the household had grown cold and watchful, when her father's temper had found new outlets, with her mother no longer there to absorb his rages. She did not yet speak of the locked room in the east wing of Cravenhurst Manor, where she had spent, over the years, more nights than she could count, or the small brass key sewn into the hem of her wedding gown, a key she had stolen from her father's desk drawer 8 months before the wedding was ever announced, though she could not have said, even to herself, exactly why. Gabriel, for his part, began to share pieces of his own grief. His father, Alaric Ashford, the previous Duke of Rensworth, had been a beloved and respected man until 3 years ago, when a set of documents surfaced, seemingly incontrovertible evidence that the old Duke had been selling naval intelligence to foreign agents. The scandal was swift and total. Alaric Ashford was convicted, stripped of his honors, and confined to an asylum for the criminally insane, rather than executed, purely as a mercy extended to the family name. Or so Gabriel had been told. His father had died there 18 months later, still insisting on his innocence to the last. "I never believed the charges," Gabriel told Evelina one evening, as they sat by the library fire, one of the few rooms in the house still fully furnished. "My father loved England more than he loved his own comfort. He would sooner have died than betray her, but evidence is evidence, and I had no way to disprove it." "What if," Evelina said slowly, "the evidence was invented?" Gabriel looked at her sharply. "Why would you say that?" "Because," Evelina said, and her voice had gone very quiet, "my father has a particular talent for inventing evidence. I have watched him do it to smaller men my whole life. Servants dismissed on manufactured charges of theft. A rival merchant ruined by forged letters. I never understood, until this moment, that he might do it to a duke." The fire crackled between them. Gabriel felt something cold and clarifying settle into his chest. Not shock, but the arrival of a suspicion he had carried, unnamed, for 3 years finally finding its shape. "Evelina," he said, "I think our marriage may have been arranged for reasons neither of us understood. If this story has you leaning forward already, this is exactly the moment to drop a comment below and tell me what you think Edmund Marchmont is really hiding. I read every single one, and it means the world to this channel when you do. And if you haven't yet, please subscribe, because the next parts of Evelina and Gabriel's story only get more dangerous from here. Now, back to Rensworth Hall. It was Agnes who found the second clue, quite by accident. The lady's maid had been unpacking the last of Evelina's trunks from Cravenhurst, trunks that had sat untouched in a storage room for weeks, low on anyone's priority during the upheaval of a new household, when she discovered, tucked into the lining of an old traveling case, a bundle of letters tied with faded green ribbon. The handwriting on the outer letter was unmistakably feminine, elegant, and old. "My lady," Agnes said, bringing the bundle to Evelina with visible unease. "These were hidden in your mother's old case. I did not read them, but I thought you should know." Evelina's hands shook as she untied the ribbon. The letters were from her mother Helena, written in the final year of her life. Not to Evelina, who had been too young then to be trusted with such things, but seemingly to herself, a kind of private diary disguised as correspondence to no one. Evelina read long into the night, and what she found rewrote everything she thought she knew about her childhood. Her mother had not died of a wasting illness. Her mother had been discovering things about her husband's finances, an elaborate scheme of falsified investments, siphoned trust funds, and blackmail targeting half the peerage of England, and in the final months of her life, she had grown convinced that Edmund intended to silence her permanently. If anything happens to me, one letter read, in handwriting grown increasingly urgent, look to the cabinet in my sitting room. I have hidden what I know inside the false bottom of the jewelry case. Evelina must never know the danger her father poses until she is old enough and safe enough to act upon it. I pray she never needs this information at all. I pray I am wrong about him, but I do not believe I am wrong. The final letter, dated only 3 weeks before her mother's death, was shorter and colder than all the rest. He knows I suspect him. I have seen the way he watches me now. If I am gone soon, do not believe whatever cause of death they give you. Trust only the key and the man who helps you find it. Evelina did not sleep that night either. She brought the letters to Gabriel at dawn, and together they sat in the gray morning light of the library, piecing together a conspiracy that had cost one woman her life and had nearly cost his father his freedom in the same conspiracy. The cabinet, Gabriel said, is it still at Cravenhurst? It was in my mother's old sitting room, Evelina said. My father converted the room after her death. I have not been permitted inside it in 9 years. Then we must find a way in, Gabriel said, and I believe I know the key that will open it. He reached for her hand, the first time he had touched her without her inviting it, and turned her wrist gently to reveal the faint white line of an old scar there, a scar Evelina had never fully explained. Not that key, he said gently, seeing her flinch. The one your mother spoke of. The brass key you sewed into your wedding gown. Evelina's breath caught. She had told him about the key only once, in passing, in the raw honesty of their first night together, and had almost forgotten she had spoken of it at all. How did you know it would matter? She asked. I didn't, Gabriel admitted. But your mother did, and I think it is time we trusted her enough to find out why. Returning to Cravenhurst Manor required careful invention. Gabriel arranged a visit under the guise of a courtesy call. A newly married Duke and Duchess paying respects to the bride's father. Entirely ordinary, entirely expected. Edmund Marchmont received them in the drawing room with his customary warmth, the same warmth that had charmed a church full of witnesses, and Evelina found herself once again astonished at how convincingly her father could manufacture affection. My dear girl, he said, kissing her cheek. Marriage agrees with you already, doesn't it, Rensworth? Remarkably, Gabriel said smoothly, though I confess my wife has been feeling the want of certain items left behind in her haste to marry. Trinkets of her mother's mostly, sentimental things. Edmund's smile did not falter, but something behind his eyes went very still. Her mother's things were disposed of long ago. Not all of them, Evelina said, meeting her father's gaze directly for perhaps the first time in her adult life. I believe the jewelry case is still in the east sitting room. A silence stretched between them, thin and dangerous as ice over a deep pond. You will find nothing of interest there, Edmund said at last, his voice carrying a warning Evelina had heard many times before, the warning that preceded punishment. But she was not a child locked in an attic room any longer. She was the Duchess of Rensworth now, and her husband stood beside her, his hand resting lightly at the small of her back, not possessively, but as a silent promise that she would not face this alone. I should like to see it regardless, Evelina said, for sentiment's sake. They were given 20 minutes, under the thin pretense of allowing the Duchess a private moment of remembrance. 20 minutes in which Evelina's hands shook so badly that Gabriel had to guide the brass key into the false bottom of the jewelry case himself. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from 9 years of dust, lay a leather ledger and a bundle of documents that would, in time, unravel the whole rotten architecture of Edmund Marchmont's fortune. The ledger detailed years of falsified accounts, money skimmed from Evelina's own maternal inheritance, funds that should have passed to her at 18, but had instead been quietly absorbed into her father's holdings through forged guardianship papers. There were records of blackmail payments from no fewer than 6 members of the peerage, and tucked at the very back, folded separately from the rest, was a set of documents bearing a name that made Gabriel's blood run cold. Alaric Ashford, Duke of Rensworth. The documents were drafts, early, unfinished versions of the very evidence that had convicted his father of treason, written in a hand Gabriel did not recognize, but a style of falsification he now recognized instantly, having spent an hour studying his wife's mother's careful, damning notes on her husband's methods. "He framed your father," Evelina whispered, staring at the papers. "He framed your father to protect his own schemes, and then he married me to you to keep the Ashford family entangled with his, to ensure you would never have reason to investigate the very man who ruined you." Gabriel said nothing for a long moment, his jaw tight with a fury that had waited 3 years to find its target. "He did not simply arrange our marriage," he said finally. "He engineered it, down to the smallest detail. He believed he was marrying his greatest liability to a man too broken by scandal to ever look closely enough to notice." "Then he made a mistake," Evelina said quietly. "Because you did look. Edmund Marchmont was not a man who left his schemes to chance, and it did not take him long to notice that his daughter had returned from Cravenhurst Manor with more than trinkets. Agnes was the first casualty. 3 days after the visit, the young maid fell violently ill after her evening meal. A sickness the household physician, hastily summoned from the village, not Dr. Wren, diagnosed as poisoning, likely administered through a contaminated delivery of tea leaves that had arrived conveniently as a wedding gift from Cravenhurst only that week. Agnes survived, but barely, and the message was unmistakable. Edmund Marchmont knew, or suspected, that his daughter had found something, and he was prepared to remove anyone standing between himself and his secrets. "We must move the ledger somewhere safer," Gabriel said, pacing before the library fire, while Evelina sat pale and shaking, having just come from Agnes's sickbed. "And we must move quickly. If he is willing to poison a servant on suspicion alone, he will not hesitate against either of us once he is certain." "There is more," Evelina said quietly. She had spent the afternoon cross-referencing her mother's letters against the ledger, and a horrifying pattern had emerged. "Look at the dates of the blackmail payments. 3 of the 6 victims died within a year of paying him, officially, all from illness. Your mother among them, my mother among them," Evelina confirmed, and her voice cracked at last, the composure of 20 years finally splintering. "He did not merely control her. He murdered her, Gabriel. The same way he intends to murder anyone else who threatens what he has built." Gabriel crossed the room and knelt before her chair, taking her trembling hands in his. "Then we will not merely expose his fraud," he said. "We will see him answer for murder. But Evelina, I need you to hear me clearly. From this moment, you are not alone in this. Whatever comes, we face it together, or we do not face it at all." For the first time since her wedding day, Evelina allowed herself to lean into another person's strength without flinching, without waiting for the cruelty that had always, in her experience, followed kindness eventually. "I am afraid," she admitted. "So am I," Gabriel said, "but I would rather be afraid beside you than safe without you." It was, though neither of them named it aloud that night, the moment the marriage of convenience quietly became something else entirely. The retaliation, when it came, was worse than either of them anticipated. 10 days after Agnes's poisoning, a fire broke out in Rensworth Hall's library in the small hours of the morning, the very room where Gabriel had begun compiling evidence, where copies of the ledger and Helena Marchmont's letters were kept locked in his father's old writing desk. Gabriel woke to the smell of smoke and the sound of Thomas the valet shouting through the corridors. He and Evelina fled the wing together, coughing, half-dressed, while the household staff formed a desperate chain of water buckets against flames that had already consumed a third of the room by the time they arrived. They saved the desk, barely. Gabriel dragged it bodily from the building himself, his hands blistered from the heat of the brass fittings, and when the fire was finally extinguished near dawn, he and Evelina sat together in the wreckage of the east lawn, soot-streaked and shaking, the rescued documents clutched between them. "He tried to kill us," Evelina said, staring at the ruined library. "Not merely to silence us, to kill us." "He tried," Gabriel agreed grimly, "and he failed, which means we no longer have the luxury of moving carefully. Evelina, It is time we brought this to the only authority even your father cannot silence. It is time we brought this before the whole of England. The path to a public inquiry was neither swift nor simple. Gabriel spent weeks quietly assembling allies, a barrister of unimpeachable reputation, a sympathetic member of the House of Lords who had himself once nearly fallen victim to one of Edmund Marchmont's blackmail schemes, and, crucially, a magistrate willing to hear evidence that implicated a peer of the realm without first being bribed into silence. Evelina, for her part, found a courage in those weeks that surprised even herself. She sat for hours with the barrister, walking through every scar, every locked door, every cruelty her father had inflicted, translating 20 years of private suffering into the language of legal testimony. It cost her something each time, old wounds reopening in the telling, but Gabriel remained beside her through every session, and slowly, the telling itself became a kind of healing. "You do not have to carry the shame of what he did to you," Gabriel told her one evening, when she wept after a particularly difficult session with the barrister. "The shame belongs entirely to him. You survived it. That is not weakness, Evelina. That is the very definition of strength." "I have spent so long believing I was unlovable," she admitted, "that the mark on my face was only the visible sign of something wrong inside me, that anyone who looked closely enough would see I deserved what he did." "Then let me be the first of many who look closely," Gabriel said, "and see nothing wrong at all. Only a woman who endured what should never have been asked of her, and who is stronger for having survived it." For the first time, Evelina let herself believe him. Edmund Marchmont, sensing the tide turning against him, did not go quietly. He attempted, through his solicitor, a man named Ambrose Reeves, who had helped draft the falsified guardianship papers years before and stood to lose everything should the conspiracy unravel, to have Evelina declared unfit to testify, citing hysteria and delusion brought on by what he called her unfortunate history of nervous complaints. It was Dr. Percival Wren, the physician Edmund had once tried to install in Evelina's household, whose name appeared on the falsified medical reports Edmund now attempted to use against her, reports that, ironically, existed in draft form among the very documents recovered from the jewelry case, proof that Edmund had been laying the groundwork to have his daughter declared insane years before she ever thought to investigate him. He always intended this, Evelina realized, reading the drafts with cold horror. If I ever grew troublesome, he meant to have me committed, the same way he had your father committed. Then we shall use his own plans against him, Gabriel said grimly, and let the magistrate see exactly what kind of man writes his daughter's madness into existence before she has ever shown a single symptom of it. The public inquiry convened at Westminster on a cold morning in late November, before a gallery packed tighter than any wedding congregation had ever been. The same society that had once gathered to mock Evelina's face now gathered to witness something far more consequential, the public unmaking of one of their own. Edmund Marchmont arrived composed, immaculately dressed, wearing the same warm smile that had deceived England for 3 decades. He greeted acquaintances in the gallery, as though attending nothing more serious than a garden party. His composure did not survive the morning. Gabriel's barrister presented the ledger first, years of falsified accounts laid bare before the magistrate, each entry corroborated by Helena Marchmont's careful, damning private notes. Then came the blackmail records, 6 names read aloud in a courtroom gone utterly silent, 3 of them former blackmail victims now deceased, under circumstances the magistrate ordered reopened for investigation that same afternoon. Then came the treason documents. Gabriel himself testified to this portion, his voice steady despite 3 years of grief, finally finding its resolution. He laid out, methodically, how the drafts recovered from Cravenhurst Manor matched, stroke for stroke, the forged evidence that had destroyed his father's name and, ultimately, his father's life. "My father died in an asylum," Gabriel told the magistrate, believing until his last breath that he had been wronged and unable to prove it. "I stand here today to prove, at last, that he was right," the gallery murmured. Edmund Marchmont's composure had begun, visibly, to crack. But it was Evelina's testimony that broke him entirely. She stood before the magistrate, the same woman England had once called too ugly to look upon directly, and she did not hide her face. She removed her glove and showed the court the scar at her wrist. She spoke, in a voice that trembled but did not falter, of locked rooms and years of silence, of a mother who had died trying to protect her, of a father who had engineered her marriage to ensure his own secrets stayed buried inside a household too devastated by scandal to look closely at anything at all. "He did not marry me to a bankrupt duke out of charity," Evelina said, meeting her father's eyes across the courtroom for the last time. "He married me to silence, believing a broken man and a disfigured daughter would never think to look for the truth. He was wrong about both of us." Edmund Marchmont rose from his seat, and for one terrible moment, England saw beneath the warm smile at last, saw the cold, calculating fury of a man who had spent decades believing himself untouchable. "You ungrateful girl," he began, his composure shattering entirely. "Everything I did." He got no further. The magistrate called for order, but the damage, or rather, the truth, was already loose in the room, and no amount of composure could call it back. By the end of that week, Edmund Marchmont, Earl of Cravenhurst, had been formally charged with fraud, blackmail, forgery, and the murder of his own wife. Ambrose Reeves, facing charges of his own, offered a full confession in exchange for leniency, corroborating every detail of the conspiracy and, crucially, providing the final evidence needed to clear the name of the late Duke of Rensworth before the House of Lords. Spring came to Rensworth Hall the way it always eventually comes to places that have survived a hard winter, slowly and then all at once. The library had been rebuilt, its shelves replenished with books Gabriel and Evelina chose together, and the estate, no longer starved of funds now that Evelina's rightful inheritance had finally been restored to her, hummed again with the quiet activity of a household with a future. Evelina stood at the tall windows of her sitting room one morning, her own room now, chosen by her, decorated in colors she had picked herself for the simple pleasure of picking them, watching Gabriel cross the lawn below with the particular unhurried contentment of a man no longer carrying the weight of an unsolved grief. She thought of the girl who had walked down the aisle at St. Aldrich's Church, trained since childhood never to let her face show pain, convinced that a birthmark and a lifetime of scars had rendered her unworthy of anything but pity. That girl would not have recognized the woman standing at this window now. Gabriel found her there when he returned, and something in his face, soft, unguarded, entirely without the careful stillness he had worn like armor on their wedding day, told her he had been thinking something similar. "I have been considering," he said, "that our marriage began under false pretenses. Not our own, but pretenses nonetheless. I think it is time we married again. Properly, this time. Not a duke and a fortune, a man and the woman he loves, choosing each other freely, with nothing left to hide and no one left to fool." "You do not need to marry me twice, Gabriel," Evelina said. Though her eyes had already filled with tears, she no longer felt any need to hide. "I chose you the moment you knelt before me and asked nothing but the truth." "Then let me ask it again," he said, taking her hands. "Not as a duke to his duchess, as Gabriel to Evelina. Will you stay and let me spend the rest of my life proving that the first man who ever truly saw you was not the one who hurt you, but the one who loved you?" "Yes," she said, and for the first time in her life, the word carried no fear at all. Yes, to all of it. Edmund Marchmont was convicted that summer on charges of fraud, blackmail, forgery, and murder, and was sentenced to transportation for the remainder of his natural life. A sentence he would serve, England's newspapers noted with grim satisfaction, in far harsher conditions than the asylum he had once condemned an innocent duke to endure. Dr. Percival Wren and Ambrose Reeves faced their own reckonings, their complicity in the conspiracy laid bare for a public no longer inclined toward mercy, for men who had profited from cruelty. Alaric Ashford's name was formally restored before the House of Lords in a ceremony Gabriel attended with quiet, unshowy grief, the vindication arriving 3 years too late to reach the man who had needed it most, but arriving nonetheless, and mattering enormously to the son who carried his memory forward. Agnes recovered fully from her poisoning and remained in service at Rensworth Hall for the rest of her working life, fiercely devoted to the mistress she had once tried to protect with a whispered warning in a wedding night dressing room. And Evelina, the woman England had once called too disfigured to be looked upon, became, in time, one of the most quietly celebrated hostesses in Yorkshire, known not for the mark upon her face, which she no longer troubled to hide beneath powder or veils, but for a particular warmth she extended to every guest who crossed her threshold, especially those the rest of society had learned to overlook. She had learned, at devastating cost, exactly what it felt like to be unseen. She made certain, for the rest of her life, that no one in her presence ever felt that way again. If Evelina and Gabriel's story moved you tonight, please take a moment to subscribe and turn on notifications. It costs nothing, and it helps this channel keep bringing you slow-burn Victorian romances like this one. And if there's a particular kind of love story you'd like to see told next, leave it in the comments below. I read every single one, and some of my favorite stories have started exactly that way. Thank you for spending this time with me, and with Evelina and Gabriel. Until the next story, take care of yourselves, and remember, the mark you carry is never the whole of who you are.